Hello birdcrafters, welcome to the springtime chat and the starts and the flycatchers. Hopefully we're going to see all of those in the next few days and weeks. Hopefully actually see them while we're out together. Maybe COVID-19 is finally going to give us a chance, give us a break. But in the meantime, I'm going to go through the various different species that I hope we can catch up with. And before we start, I'm just going to point out that chats and starts are actually in the same family as thrushes, whereas flycatchers are in a family of their own. In this session, we're only looking at 7 species. That doesn't mean to say it's going to be easy, because at least 2 lots of them are confusion pairs, and so we need to look at them in a bit more detail. Each one will have the sound of the bird in song and also the contact calls, or at least one of the regular contact calls you can listen to. We're going to start with stonechat. Now the stonechat is probably the bird that we see most frequently, because we can find it in both the summer and the winter, and you can find it in moorland areas, you can find it in maritime heaths, and you can certainly find it, at least in the winter period, in quite a lot of lowland areas, lots of places where there are rough grasslandy situations with maybe a bit of gorse mixed in. That's a typical location to find it. The male is easy to identify. He's pretty distinctive with his beautiful blackish head and that gorgeous sort of white collar, orange suffusion on the breast, and that little perky tail which constantly twitches is another indicator that you're looking at a stonechat, irrespective of whether it's a male or a female. So who among us has never seen a stonechat perched on a gorse bush? I think it is the classic image. It's not one that is an imagined image, it's a real thing, because they do have a propensity for perching on gorse bushes. That's because they tend to be in the habitats that they favour, whether it be upland, moorland areas or maritime heaths, or even in lowland sort of dry soil, free draining soil areas. And you'll often find that the pairs and even the individuals will be perched up quite prominently, flicking their tails, tacking away, and then they'll dive down to catch an insect, because of course these guys are insectivores. Just look at the big eye in proportion to the size of the bird. That's because it's using real good visual acuity to enable it to see its insect prey. One of the reasons that I like to concentrate on the character of a bird and the shape of a bird, as much as anything else to do with plumage marks and the like, is simply because so often, as is the case with the stonechat, you get birds with contrasting plumages. So the male's got that wonderful black head, highly contrasted collar. The female, on the other hand, has a buff head and barely discernible collar at times, but it's a ghosted image of the male. Still has the orangey washed underparts. Some females look quite pale on the back, others look quite dark, and it's often an age-related thing. So the darker the bird is, the older the bird tends to be. So that's why I want you to concentrate on the shape and the way that birds move and the like. And stonechats, as we know, are very, very distinct. They're perky birds, keeping that upright posture that I mentioned before, that tail twitch, keep that in mind as well. And look at the shape, look at the length of the bill, look at the size of the head proportionate to the bird. All those kinds of things are going to help you identify your stonechat. I think this is a really interesting graphic. This is taken from the Cheshire and Wirral Atlas, and it shows a real concentration of birds along the Mersey Valley area and also along the Dee, and to an extent along the coastal strip of Wirral. And then there's huge gaps in the central parts of Cheshire, possibly explained by the lack of decent habitat. I mean, it's very dominated by pastoral landscapes and by certain arable areas, so maybe it's the lack of habitat that's meaning there's a big hole in distribution. And then you've got a concentration again on the eastern side up along the border with Derbyshire. And what's notable about that is it wasn't noted in the first atlas, but only in the survey period for the second atlas, the Cheshire and Wirral atlas. Now, I think that's purely observer bias, because there would have been birds up there during the original atlas survey period. So yeah, I take that bit with a pinch of salt, but it does show how the birds are distributed on the side of the rough grasslands, or where there's a bit of maritime heath or heathland in general, or in moorland in that case, and they're certainly absent from those pastoral areas of central Cheshire. Just one glance at a whinchat and straight away you know it's a close relative of stonechat, but there are big differences in the way that they live their lives, and its main thing being that the one is a wholly migratory bird, that's the whinchat, and the stonechat is at least a partial migrant, in the sense that it leaves a number of birds behind during the winter months, and as a consequence of that, the whinchat is much the scarcer of the two, and it's become increasingly scarce over recent years and decades. Certainly when I was a young boy watching birds, I would find whinchat without too much difficulty at places like Frodsham Marsh and around Woolston Eyes as a breeding bird. It's entirely disappeared from Cheshire as a breeding bird. Just occasionally the odd pair will stick as it's passing through, but it's a real rarity like that now. What we're left with is passage birds, and we see them at places like the North Shore of the Wirral. We might see them at somewhere like Carr Lane on the parts of the Mersey, or you might come across them at a location along a river system. Just as I did this morning, 13th of May, one was passing through, but they'll have started as early as the middle of April. Birds were passing through. So you've got a window of around about a month to catch up with a whinchat, unless you get the chance to go up into the moorland areas, which is where they're going to be breeding. Now, they'll breed up there and they'll pass back through the same sorts of localities that they pass through in the springtime. So even if you don't get one in this spring, you may get one this autumn. So when is a whinchat and not a stonechat? Well, let's have a look at the perching shape. Mostly whinchats tend to be slightly more horizontally positioned when they are perching compared to stonechats, stonechats being rather more upright. However, this is a guideline, it's not a rule. Birds can change shape and position on any perch, and so you have to look at some other things as well, and we're going to have to look at the colours and patterns of the bird, because structurally they're very, very similar. This is a male in this picture. Look at that brilliant white supercilium. You don't get that on a stonechat. It's got a fantastic black bandit mask that goes through the eye and onto the ear coverts, and then underneath that has a pale line, contrasting pale line. Then you've got that orangey wash breast, which is very similar to stonechat. The back is variegated, a bit paler than on stonechat, but it still could be mistaken for stonechat. Another area that you need to concentrate on with this bird is the tail, and we'll look at that in the next illustration. So this illustration shows the point that I want to make about the tail. At the top end of the tail, either side of the central point, are pale patches, and they show up at a great distance. The rest of the tail looks rather like the T-bar shape on the tail of a wheatear, and that can be seen at some distance. When the bird's in flight particularly, you will see this, and it contrasts with that of the stonechat, which is largely dark on the tail, and it's a real help at any stage when you're looking to separate out windchat and stonechat. Female windchat is not easy to identify because they're so similar to stonechats, female stonechats. Now, if you look carefully at this bird, you can see that pale supercilium, but that shows up reasonably well, but it's not that discernible at times and can make you think you're looking at stonechat. But help is at hand if you remember to think about the position of the bird. Look at that much more horizontal stance. That's one thing. Now, in the previous slide, we looked at the tail. That's another thing. Look at that T-bar effect and the pale patches at the base of the tail. If you get a chance to see that point, concentrate on that. If you see those white patches, you're looking at a windchat. And with all that muted coloration, you're almost certainly looking at a female windchat. Or maybe you're looking at a first autumn bird, first winter bird, as they're sometimes referred to. So, not easy, but doable. So don't panic when you come across a bird, potentially a female windchat. So here's the atlas map showing the breeding distribution of windchat in Cheshire, and there's a big dot in the Frodsham area, and because actually there was one confirmed breeding record from the Frodsham area, first time in 14 years, during the Atlas survey period, but everywhere else, all those other dots, almost certainly they are birds that are on passage. They didn't stick and breed, and it just proves the point that this is a bird that has melted away as a breeding bird in our region and across huge swathes of the UK as a whole. What is there not to love about the northern wheatear? It really is a charismatic bird. It has a most intriguing migratory strategy. It's absolutely stunning looking thing. Both males and females are good looking birds. Perky in nature, they sort of drop in and out of the furrows of a ploughed area. One minute you think there's one bird, then there's half a dozen. It's really characterful. It spends its summers up in the upland sort of stream side areas of sheep walks, and also a few coastal areas. We don't tend to see it across the greater margins of territories like pasture lands or on arable fields through the summer months, but it really is a bird of passage through our area at that time. And as a species in general, it's doing quite well. It's holding its own. It's not really declined in line with things like the winchat and one or two other species. So it's still a thing that we can look forward to, plentiful numbers on the North Wirral or around the Hale Head area during the spring migration period. And the passage period lasts all the way from early March right through to mid-May. So one look at this image and it helps you understand how the wheatear got its name. Wheatear is a translation of the Nordic whittier, which is white arse, and white arse it is. It also has white on the tail sides, down to about halfway or the length of the tail, and it creates with a black terminal band with a sort of central spike of black going up it like a T-bar. Look out for that. It's utterly unmistakable. There are a few other wheatears, of course, that have similar tail patterns, but they're very, very rare in the UK, and we won't need to worry about that. Male northern wheatear, probably one of the easiest species to identify in the UK bird book. When you look at it, it's got very distinctive marks like the black banded mask and the black wings. If you can't see the rump, it doesn't really matter because you've got plenty to go on. You've got the silvery head and back, you've got the pale underbody, and you've probably got some ochreous coloration on the throat at least, and maybe on the upper breast. This bird only has it on the throat, but it tells me that it's a bird of the UK, most likely, because the amount of orange diffusion varies across the geographical races and gets more intense and extensive if it's going to be a bird of the far north and across to Alaska. So more of that in a moment. The bird itself, it looks quite leggy, it's quite mobile, it's a bouncy bird. They'll often do this kind of tail twitch bob as they're about to go down into a furrow, and they make a type noise at the same time. So yeah, very, very distinctive bird. Female's a bit more difficult, and we'll take a look at that now. So female northern wheatear is a bit less distinct than the male. In this case, this image shows a female with rather a greyish back, which tells me she's probably quite an old bird. Younger birds tend to be a bit browner on the back, and so they look a bit different to the males in that respect. Her wings are quite black lined. She's got a small dark line between the eye and the beak. That's an area referred to as the lores, but it's not like the big bandit mask of the male by any stretch of the imagination. She's got a little bit of ochreous coloration on the throat. Again, it's not very extensive, and the shape of the bird and the way it's standing tells me it's a bird of the UK or maybe regions adjacent to that, but it's certainly not a bird from Alaska. I'll explain more about that in a moment. So this map taken from the Cheshire Atlas shows a huge concentration really of birds up in the eastern side in terms of a breeding context, so up in the Pennine areas up around the Peak District. The rest of it is scattered small dots, and that tells you that they're not confirmed as breeding sites necessarily, and the fact that they're not confirmed is probably because they aren't actually breeding there, they're passing through rather than actually sticking around. Having said that, they do breed occasionally in lowland areas of Cheshire, and it's nearly always on a brownfield type setting, which kind of apes or mimics the sort of ground that they would be nesting in the upland areas. So if you're looking for northern wheatear as a breeding species in lowland Cheshire, always seek out big extensive brownfield areas, particularly ones that are just starting to vegetate over and get a little mossy and a little bit of grass growing on them. That's the sort of locations you're going to find them. They tend to nest in rabbit burrows. That's one of their favourite locations. So let's take a closer look at the migratory strategies and routes of northern wheatear. Wheatears do breed extensively across what's called the Palearctic region, and they breed in places like northern Morocco, where there's a variation called Seebohm's wheatear, which looks like black-eared wheatear. And then you go up through Spain and up to France and the UK, and obviously we've got a substantial breeding population here. But birds that are of Icelandic origin, and also birds that go across to Alaska and to Canada, well, they look a little bit different. So we're going to take a closer look at those. But the one thing you should know is that the birds that travel the furthest are covering 15,000 kilometres each way on their migratory journeys, which makes it the longest distance passerine migrant in the world. So just on that score alone, the wheatear, the northern wheatear, is a pretty inspiring bird. So this image is a female wheatear that I photographed quite recently in the Liverpool area, and if you look carefully, she's rather upright in her stance. She's also got quite a lot of ochreous orangey suffusion on the throat, but also extending at least down to the upper belly area. Now, she's not the brightest of wheatears that I've ever seen by any stretch of imagination, but just that stance, the length of the wing, which is a bit longer than typical, and also all that sort of suffusion on the breast, that tells me this is probably a northern bird, and I would think that this is a bird probably of Icelandic origin. And I say that because I'm putting it in context with the next bird that you're going to see. So this bird was photographed within minutes of the other bird at the same locality, but she was distinctly different. She was quite a little bit bigger. She had noticeably long wings. She was upright in stance most of the time. This very rich coloration of the orange on the breast went all the way down through to the vent, rather grey-brown back, sort of a hint of a facial mask, and also a very distinct supercilium. All these things combine together to tell me that this is a Greenland wheatear. Now, Greenland wheatears are passing through our region between mid-April and mid-May. You've got a chance in the next few days of seeing one at a coastal locality, Hilbre Island, Crosby area, somewhere like that. But by their third week, end of third week, they've generally gone through, and we won't see them again until the autumn. But this is a bird with an extended migratory journey. Those long wings are designed to power it on this long distance migratory flight. It's geared for that passing over the Atlantic. A pretty phenomenal journey by any standards. Northern wheatear is not hard to find on migration. Basically any ploughed field at the right time of year may attract one, but there are a variety of premier locations to go looking for them. Hale Head is the one that's closest to me and probably to the majority of you. And then you've got the likes of the Seaforth, Crosby area, the North Wirral Shore, Hilbre Island is another hot spot, as well as locations further afield like Great Orme, Point Linus and South Stack. Unlike the northern wheatear, black redstart is a seriously scarce bird. It's very scarce as a breeding bird and no guarantee of finding it at any particular locality anywhere in the northwest. London it's slightly different. There are still a few breeding pairs at traditional localities there, and I'll explain more about that in a moment or two. But let's look at the male black redstart. He's an absolutely stunning bird. Black face, most of the body is that sort of silvery grey black look to it, and he's also got these white patches on the wing which are really prominent, and then there's got rusty red vent and tail which shivers just like somebody smacking a tuning fork. That is what you're looking out for in terms of black redstart. It's dark and really almost sooty black when you compare it to a common redstart, female or male, and that's one of the chief ways you'll identify. Also, it's divided by habitat, although you can find both in the same localities at certain times during migration. Basically, black redstarts are like open settings, very sort of urban or rocky settings, whereas certainly in the UK the common redstart is more or less confined to woodland sites, often quite open woodland sites, but woodland sites nonetheless. Female black redstart is much more difficult to identify than a male. It could easily be mistaken for a female common redstart, but what I would suggest that you concentrate on is the fact that the duskiness, the greyness, extends right through onto the lower belly and towards the vent itself. Overall, it's a slightly paler looking bird than a male. She's usually got quite a prominent eye ring, and also the same sort of tail pattern. You know, they've got that red start or red tail with the red vent and also the red rump area. So it also shivers its tail just like the male does. So you can certainly get it down to red start straight away, but separating out male and female black red starts fairly straightforward. Separating out female black red starts with common red start, bit more complicated. Don't forget to look at the coloration overall of the belly area of the bird. So I'm going to row back a little bit on what I just said about how easy it is to identify male and female black red starts. Let's throw in a first summer male. They look very, very female-like, mainly because they lack the black facial mask of a 2 or 3 year old male black red start. They also lack the white patch on the wing, so they do look female-like. They're a bit darker overall, so there is a chance to separate them out. But also, if it's singing, as this bird was when I photographed it a couple of weeks ago in Liverpool, hey, that's going to be a male black red start. So yeah, it's not always straightforward, but I can assure you a first summer male black red start is even more distinct from a female common red start than a female black red start is from a common red start. So you know, you've got a better chance of picking this up as a black red start. Don't forget, when you're looking for black red start, you want to be looking in more urban localities. So if you're in the centre of Liverpool, the centre of Manchester, anywhere like that, you've got half a chance of hearing a black red start singing, particularly during the COVID-19 crisis when there's been virtually no traffic around. Probably the easiest time to pick up a black red start, but never easy to find them in any circumstances under normal conditions. If you gazed at this map from the RSPB, you'd think black red start was quite generally distributed around the UK, but the blue is just birds that turn up in winter. But you know, it's take that with a pinch of salt. It's places where they do turn up and may winter, but they won't do that every single year, and it won't be a general distribution of birds. The yellow areas are kind of vaguely where the birds prefer to breed, and again, I really would take that with a pinch of salt, because it varies enormously about how much habitat is available. So for instance, down in the London area where there's still a concentration of black red stars, they were very, very rare until after the Blitz. When the Blitz occurred, it created all this habitat that potentially black red stars could occupy, and so they did, and the numbers built up rapidly. And then they dwindled as we rebuilt areas, and they still go to certain localities within London and also one or two parts of the northwest. The Birmingham population has virtually collapsed from changes in habitat there. And a typical year, there'll be somewhere between 60 and 70 pairs as a maximum in the UK, and virtually 2/3 of those or more will be in the London area. So we're scratching around really for the remainders, and it might be on a power station like Fiddler's Ferry Power Station, or it might be in the centre of Liverpool, or it might be in the centre of Manchester where there's a breeding pair. And literally we're talking about 1 or 2 breeding pairs on a typical year in somewhere like Liverpool, and they're darned hard to find. Male common redstarts are beautiful birds. They're very distinctive, of course, with that high contrast black face and throat set against a white brow, and then you've got that fiery breast and belly area extending right down to the tail. They can look a little bit like a robin, and it's not unknown for them to get mixed up with robins, so don't have a go at yourself if you make that mistake. Let's be honest, Aristotle made that mistake many generations ago when he was a student of birds and bird migration, and he thought that common redstarts transmuted themselves into robins during the Greek winter. So similar are they in structure, but don't forget that shivering tail. That's the thing that's going to help you separate it from a robin. You won't make that mistake if you look for the shimmering tail. Black redstart, again, a bit of a confusion, I suppose, but it lacks the white patch on the wings that you get on fully adult black redstarts, and it has much greater extent of orange on the breast and belly of common redstart. Okay, so separating out common redstart females from black redstart females is, I grant you, a bit more difficult. But look at the belly area, look at the vent area. Is that considerably paler than the rest of the bird? If so, you're probably looking at a common redstart. Is it in woodland? If it's in woodland, it's almost certainly going to be a common redstart. Certainly 999 times out of 1,000. So that's the best thing that you can do. That's the best guideline that I can give you with regard to that. Female black redstarts are much sootier underneath, and they tend to prefer more open areas, craggy areas, open plough maybe they may settle on occasionally during the migration period, but generally they're not a woodland bird. Common redstart is a bird of woodland, open woodland. So this graphic from the Cheshire Bird Atlas backs up what I was saying before about the distribution of breeding redstarts, common redstarts here in our region. Look at that concentration up on the Pennine area in those upland woodlands. There's a real concentration there, and then there's a sort of dots or series of dots in the central part. That's the Delamere complex. There's a bit of another concentration down on the Welsh Shropshire border areas, and there are probably places like Peckforton where you could pick the odd pair up if you went and carefully searched. On migration, it's slightly different. They do turn up in all kinds of locations. Just think of places where you might see wheatears, for instance, and they can just as easily turn up in those localities. North Wirral Shore, around the Hale Head area, all that kind of stuff. They're not irregular, out of context during the passage periods. We're coming to the end of that now. We're kind of looking at the sort of 14th, 15th of May, coming to that period of time, and basically most of the birds should be on territory by now. And so your best chance is to go to favoured breeding areas to see one in the next week or two. This is quite an illuminating graphic in terms of how many passerines make their migration, and redstart, common redstart, is no different in that. Although the stop point for the birds here is not the UK, it's exactly the same principle. But these birds are obviously wintering down in West Africa, and then they're making just one or two pit stops en route to their final journey. So they're really banging away, covering huge distances on some of these migratory passage journeys. We're talking sometimes excess of a couple of thousand miles just to reach the next stop point. That's pretty phenomenal. Oh, by no means is it unique, and by no means is it the most extensive migration, but it's a good example of how far and how fast these birds can travel when they really need to. I think a male pied flycatcher is pretty unmistakable. problem being that they usually are in woodland settings, so not necessarily easily observed, and the weak song that you've been listening to isn't always that discernible, not so obvious, and it doesn't necessarily draw the observer's attention. Listen out to it carefully, because from my ear it often sounds reminiscent of something like reed bunting, but obviously a reed bunting singing in woodland doesn't make sense. So if you ever get that feeling that you listen to a reed bunting in a woodland setting, I'd follow that up. It might turn out to be a pied flycatcher. So the female pied flycatcher shown here on the right, she looks like a ghost version of the male, really, like a pale, faded out version. The grey-brown replacing the black, and the white on the wing not so extensive. What you can see in this picture, however, is how long these wings are, because this is a long distance migrant, and it arrives here in early April, sets up camp, if you like, usually in bird boxes these days. And as a result of that, we've studied pied flycatchers extensively in terms of their breeding strategy. They've got a really interesting breeding strategy, because you often get a situation where they've got one male servicing two, sometimes more females. And on top of that, females are notorious for doing a thing called egg dumping, in other words, laying eggs into the nests of other females. A bit cuckoo-like in a sense. And we only know this because they're using nest boxes. It means we've got easy access to their nests, so we can study it more readily than we can in natural nest sites. Pied flycatcher is not a common bird locally, but it's actually increased in numbers rather than decreasing. But it's been lost from extensive parts of the region where it used to breed, and it's now concentrating in other areas. So for instance, in the Cheshire context, it used to be quite commonly found on one or two locations on the Wirral. It's gone from there. It was extensively breeding in Delamere. It's declined there, but it has increased markedly on the east side of the county, up in the Pennine area, and nearly all of the birds are using boxes as opposed to natural sites. A natural site would have been something like an old woodpecker nest. As a consequence of using the boxes, it appears that the predation rate is lower than on natural nest sites, and it may be that populations that use these adopted boxes are having a higher reproduction rate and therefore increasing in numbers. Classic sites to go and look for them would be around Teg's Nose and up at other reservoir sites up close to the Pennine area on the border with Derbyshire. That's where I tend to go searching for pied flycatchers, but they're commonly found also obviously on migration at alternative points. Any bit of woodland edge around the coastal areas of our counties will probably pick up the odd pied flycatcher during the early April period. I'd look out for them then, and then later on in the autumn we'll get them coming back through, and again they'll turn up at all kinds of odd locations where they don't breed. Pied flycatcher is a long distance migrant. You can see from this graphic that it's basically in West Africa, and it's below the Sahara, so it needs to be able to do extensive long hop migratory journeys, pretty similar to the redstart graphic that you saw earlier. The timing of arrival of these long distance migrants has been impacted by the change in climate, and the problem that has happened is that they're getting slightly out of step with the peak time for caterpillar availability, and they're timing their migration so they arrive here and hatch their young at the peak moment of caterpillar availability to feed their chicks. If that gets out of kilter, as it has done, it can affect the reproductive rate, but it's been noticed that over recent years the arrival time of things like pied flycatchers has become noticeably earlier than it was 25, 30 or more years ago. So they are adapting to the change, but in the meantime you're seeing changes in distribution caused directly by climate change. Spotted flycatcher, one of our latest migrants. You don't expect to see them really until May at the earliest, and it's usually the second week of May before there's any general arrival, and it's sometimes the end of May before they've completely filled in. They're really a specialist of aerial insects, and they're really quite easy to see as a bird because they tend to sally out from a prominent perch within a woodland setting, usually like an amphitheatre type setting, sally out, catch an insect, go back to the same perch or one close by, and they'll do that repeatedly. What it's not easy to do with this bird is actually to hear it. Its song is incredibly weak, as you've heard, and you can't really, as a surveyor or somebody doing a transect or something looking for spotted flycatchers, rely on listening out for the song, because the noise clutter in the UK is bad anyway, and then it just gets overwashed in terms of this bird's song. We just don't pick it up. I'm sure it's quite audible to other spotted flycatchers, but it's not to us. So your best way of surveying for them is to actually look for them. Where do you look for them? Suburbia used to be the key locality. There used to be masses of spotted flycatchers across the UK. Only 35-40 years ago, they bred all over the place in big suburban gardens with lots of wooded cover, but we've lost them dramatically, and we're not quite sure why, but I'm going to try and examine that in a little bit of detail in the next couple of graphics. So again, we're using the Cheshire Atlas as our baseline for distribution. You can see here that there's a kind of general easterly bias to the distribution of these birds, and they do tend to be associated with wooded areas. There's quite a strong association also with wooded areas along watersides, if you look carefully at the graphics there. Not entirely, as I mentioned, suburbia is still an important element, but we've lost them dramatically. The next graphic is going to show just how much loss we've suffered in the past 30 years or so. So this graphic, also from the Cheshire Atlas, really illustrates the loss. All the red dots are where the bird was found during the original Atlas period 78 to 84. The updated Atlas 2004 to 2006, those red dots are places where birds are now absent, and that's really a significant decline. I myself, when I was being a resolute ranger at places like Whitby Park in Ellesmere Port, could readily find 3 or 4 pairs when I was first there at the beginning of the 1990s. But by the middle of the 1990s, the birds had entirely gone from that park when there previously been 3 or 4 pairs, and the same pattern followed extensively across the region and across suburban parts of our region. Why were we losing these birds? It wasn't obvious. There wasn't any significant change to what was going on in the UK. Was it a declining number of available flying insects? Who knows? The next graphic might give us a bit more of a clue as to what's been going on. So spotted flycatcher is one of our longest distance migrants. It winters from the Gulf of Guinea all the way down to South Africa, and we don't quite know what has driven the big decline, but there are some hints as to what the main problem may be. Certainly the survival rate of first winter birds has dropped significantly. We do know that there's been a decline of something like 75% within our region between the first atlas and the second atlas in Cheshire. That's just 22 years. That is a huge decline. Thankfully, things seem to have stabilised a little bit since then, but is the reduction of flying insects in the UK a major problem, or is the problem more likely to be down in Africa? As we know, there have been significant changes to habitats in Africa in the last 2 or 3 decades because of increased human pressure, and also because of the widespread use of pesticides where it didn't used to take place. So it looks like the main problem is actually in Africa. It's not in the UK. But I'm sure our use of pesticides and our decline of insects is helping, or contributing, should we say, to the decline of the birds here. Hopefully things, as I say, have stabilised to an extent, and maybe we'll see a recovery at some point. In the meantime, we can still find spotted flycatchers, and they can still turn up in urban areas and breed in your your flower box or in your crowd cavity in your wall or wherever it may be. So you can still find it. It's still a bird we can enjoy, and there's nothing better than being in a big woodland ride and watching the spotted flycatchers ripping out from a woodland branch, snapping an insect and then flying back to that perch. It's one of the joys of a British summer. Well, there we have it, folks. That's our chat about chats, starts and flycatchers. I hope you got something from it. I hope you enjoyed it. And obviously it's now time for your tea, your coffee, or, as I know you all so well, something with alcohol in it. I look forward to seeing you in a few minutes' time. Your cherubic faces will light up the screen, and hopefully you'll illuminate the world with your questions, and we'll have a lot of fun at the same time. Take care now.